When I ask UX people who practice user research what is their biggest challenge, I often hear how hard it is to engage stakeholders with research. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Okay. I think the most important thing, and it's quite ironic when you think about it, but the most important thing is empathy. So empathy with your stakeholders, trying to understand what their needs are, trying to understand what their priorities are, thinking about how they see the world. These are all things that we do naturally when we look at user behavior and look at consumer behavior, and sometimes don't think about it and don't do it naturally when we think about our stakeholders' behavior. And so I think we would see much better engagement with people if we better understood what their needs were and aligned our actions with those needs.
What would you recommend to in-house UX researchers who are always trying to identify opportunities for impactful research if they want to better identify such opportunities?
I think the most important thing is to understand the product roadmap. It's very similar to the first answer in that sense, that by understanding why people have prioritized things in the way that they have, and understanding why they're deciding to build the things that they're building, I think understanding that can give you great insight into the types of things they're likely to respond well to. And if you can understand those things, you can adapt your plan around it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you do those things. They may not be the right things to do, but it means that at least you're better positioned to understand how people might react to something and how you might change the way you tell a story to influence somebody.
So UX researchers sometimes experience a tension between conducting research they were asked to do by their stakeholders, for example, product managers and engineers, versus research they were not asked to do but think they should do. What are your thoughts on balancing this tension?
I think the tension is very real. I've experienced it myself many times. The one method, typically what people say in these scenarios is, well, you should do more field research and you should bring your stakeholders out into the field. I've had mixed success with that approach because trying to get somebody out of the office for days, even weeks sometimes at a time, is incredibly difficult, especially if they don't understand the value they're going to derive from the study. So a method I've employed that I think can lead to people becoming interested in going and spending time out of the office is to basically do dual studies. So, if for example, a stakeholder asks you to do a usability test or something very tactical, or help them find out about a very niche part of the UI, you may or may not think that's the best thing and most important thing for the project, but I think you can do it because it will be helpful. And you can just add on extra time. Researchers are in control of the study. You're in control of how much time the participant comes in for. So if the usability study is going to take 45 minutes, bring someone in for 90 minutes. And for those first 45, or for the second 45, depending on whatever makes sense, do your own thing. Do the thing that you think would be most impactful. And what I've found, and it's funny, stakeholders will say, why are you doing this? You don't need all that time with people, and why are you covering this other thing? That doesn't really matter, because you can say to them, well, I'm meeting your needs, so this is just other extra stuff that we're going to do because we're interested in it and we're trying to build a base of knowledge or something like that. And often what I've found, in most cases, the stakeholders are far more interested in the 45 minutes that they didn't request. And it totally changes their perceptions of research and the value that they can derive and help them make decisions, from very tactical usability to more exploratory research things like getting people to draw maps or mapping out their world, or even stuff like card sorting.
Tell me about using designers as proxies to engineers and product managers.
I've done this in the past. There have been times when I've worked in teams and I've had a very strong relationship with the product manager. We work directly together and with the engineers. There are times when that wasn't the case. There are times when I worked on projects where they didn't want a researcher. They didn't think they needed a researcher. The team thought they had clarity of vision in what they were doing and didn't need research to to vet it. And so in those circumstances, the designers didn't feel that way. The designers thought about users, valued user-centered design, understood the value of research. And so in those circumstances, I would work very closely with the designers, and I would try and influence through the research I did what they designed and how they designed things. And then they would communicate that with the team, and they would argue for building things in one way versus another way. So I've used it in the past, and I think it works, except in circumstances where you're trying to build relationships over a period of like 6 months, 12 months, a year. If you're going to be in something for the long haul, measured in years, using designers as proxies may not be the best way to do it.
What are some pros and cons of proxying through designers?
The pros are that you can get things changed. If you have obviously this is all dependent on, using designers as proxies is dependent on you having a good relationship with them. So I'm going to assume you have a good relationship with them, because if you don't, you have more fundamental problems. If you have a good relationship with them, and the pros are that you will see a lot of your recommendations and a lot of the things that you think should be done designed in the product. And product managers and engineers may try and change those things a little bit, but you'll see you'll be able to directly map UI decisions or product decisions back to research findings. So that's fantastic. The con is obviously that you're sacrificing relationships to do that. It's an opportunity cost. You're no longer spending the time to build relationships with other people, the product managers or engineers. And so if designers leave or if they move teams, then it's a risk. You may not have the same rapport with the new designers that come in. And so this is why I would say it's good for a limited period of time. If you want to have impact on something over a period of weeks and maybe a few months, I think this is a good strategy. If you're looking to work on something for like up to 12 months, 18 months, then it's much better to not use designers as proxies and just work very hard at building relationships with all the other people.
Many UX researchers are always looking for creative deliverables that engage their stakeholders with research findings. What are some deliverables you found to be working well for you?
I'm a big fan of physical artifacts. So one of the problems that we have is everyone is suffering from information overload. Everyone has too much email. Everyone has too many docs and too many spreadsheets and things that they have to digitally track and read and consume. And so when research is presented in that format, it's just another thing in the midst of many, many things. And thinking back to the first questions around priorities and having empathy for the people you're dealing with and understanding their priorities, your research is one of many priorities. They have lots of business priorities. They're not, user needs are not necessarily top of mind for all of the things they're thinking about. And so physical artifacts kind of get around that problem because you're basically sidestepping that issue. They're also very good, I've found, because they're a constant reminder. So things I've done in the past that have worked are creating posters and huge posters. If you don't have a background in design, you can get designers to help you create compelling posters and putting those in areas that people often frequent, like if you have a mini kitchen in your office or even in the bathrooms, on the way to the bathrooms, going in and out of the workspace, these kind of heavily trafficked areas and places where people linger, places where people make cups of coffee and they have to wait for a minute for the coffee to boil or heat up, and they have a minute to kill. And so if this poster is sitting there and it looks attractive, people will just naturally consume it. I wouldn't be afraid of, I think diagrams in these posters is very important. Visually representing research findings is very important. And I wouldn't be worried about having these posters be complicated. Some of the posters that I had a ton of information in them. It would take many hours of study to understand what was going on. But that was okay, because the poster is going to be there for 3 months, 6 months, and every day people are making cups of coffee and they'll just consume it bit by bit. And what I found in my experience was that in the beginning no one really talks to you about it, and slowly but surely people start approaching you and going, oh, I saw your name on the poster, like that was really interesting, and it just, you start to have a much kind of greater impact over a longer period of time.
Different topic. Some UX research practitioners believe that they should only provide findings and never offer recommendations following UX studies. They let their teams figure out what needs to be done by themselves, believing that this is a better way for getting better results out of research. What are your thoughts on this approach?
I think you can look at this both ways. I have a very strong bias towards recommending solutions. My background is originally in design, so I just naturally think that way. Other people, other researchers, excellent researchers that I've worked with in the past, don't feel that way at all. They feel that you should divorce yourself from recommendations, and you should be an impartial, objective observer of facts. I think there are pros and cons to both. I think if you divorce yourself, it's obviously, first of all, much harder to map the work you did to the impact that you had. One of the ways that I vet myself, I guess, is how did I change code that shipped, or potentially code that didn't ship. Maybe the research said it shouldn't ship, but how did the product change? And that's often my measure of success. And if that's your measure of success, providing recommendations is very important. But there's also a lot to be said for remaining impartial. One of the things that I've struggled with in the past sometimes is people felt that I was pushing recommendations too hard. I was too opinionated. And what that does is really you're doing an injustice to yourself, because they start to then poke holes in the research. And there was nothing wrong with the research, and the findings are still valid. But because you're trying to push something hard, people are more likely to push back at everything you've done. So I think it depends. Again, it depends on your goals, and I think there are pros and cons to both.
Last question: how can researchers tell if their stakeholders are bought into research? It's an incredibly difficult thing to pinpoint. It's mostly through the relationship you have with people. It's probably mostly going to be an intuitive gut feel. Like you can try and I've done this in the past. I've tried to measure impact. Like I've created tracking spreadsheets where it's like, here's all the stuff we found out in our research, and here are all the product changes that we think should happen, and how many of them happened. And that's one way of trying to measure how impactful you were and how engaged your stakeholders were because they decided to make the changes. I've kind of moved away from that in the past few years. I think there's problems with trying to measure things that way. There are many other reasons why product managers or engineers may decide not to do something the way you thought it should be done. And it's not because they didn't think your research was good, or it's not because they don't agree with you. There are many situations where people do agree that this is a good recommendation, but there are other business reasons why they shouldn't do it. And that goes back to the earlier point again of understanding people's needs, having empathy for your stakeholders. And kind of another interesting thing on this kind of final point is people, and I guess it comes back to the divorcing yourself from the findings. Sometimes it's very hard to know what you have had an impact on. You may feel that people aren't changing things, but because you have those posters in the kitchens and because you're building longer term relationships with people, changes happen, and they happened as a result of your research, but you didn't necessarily know, or you can't necessarily pinpoint that. And I've always struggled with this, but I'm becoming more comfortable with that idea. I'm becoming more comfortable with the idea that I may not be able to understand how I've influenced people in their decision making, and that's okay. That's okay. If good products get built and get shipped that we're proud of, that you're proud of, that don't have all your findings but have some of them, are just good products, then I think that's success. All right, this is all I have for you. Is there anything else you think you want to say?
I don't think so.
All right.